This time on Sports and Society, sports and primary and secondary education.
Most of what goes on in sport goes on off the playing field.
It's about what you have on them in order to protect yourself.
I was first raped violently.
Well, you're finished. You'll never play football again.
Obviously, shoe contracts worth $400,000 or $500,000.
Morals and ethics don't exist above and beyond the society that they're a part of.
Nowadays, kids are faced with the choice of do you want a couple of $1 million or your college degree?
Sport is a metaphor for what goes on in the real world.
What is the role of athletics in primary and secondary education? Some claim that sports participation can assist in the personal and academic development of young people. Are sports a diversion from the core values of primary and secondary education, or a means to achieve those values? Should schools integrate sports into their academic curriculum or eliminate school sports and leave this activity to local youth sports clubs and leagues? What are the values and responsibilities that school administrators should consider in making these decisions? These are some of the issues considered at the Summit, the first international conference on ethics in sports. Let's revisit the Summit and join the discussion.
Here's what can happen in a sport. I watch children come together who are African American, Caucasian American, Oriental American, and we put them in the same color shirt, and we sweat together, and we bleed together. And over a period of time, these two or 3 or 10 groups of children that have been taught to hate each other's guts find out that sweat smells about the same on everybody. And when we're busted in the mouth, that blood is about the same color on everybody. And those children who were raised to hate learn to love each other and become brothers. That's what can happen in competitive athletics if it's administered properly, and that's what ought to happen.
Ethical standards have always been played a little bit looser in sports than in other contexts. You know, sport has been related to this notion or sport programs have been related to this notion that sport builds character. And of course, coming out of a Puritan tradition, how do you build character? You know, well, especially if sport comes out of the values and experiences of men, you know, a little bit of toughness, a little bit of challenge, a little bit of suffering is really good for you. And if a little bit is really good, then the more suffering, the tougher it is, the better it is for you. And so we don't raise a question when a elementary school football coach grabs some kid's helmet, twists their neck, pulls them to their knees, looks in their eyes and demeans them, where we'd have that 6th grade teacher in a court of law tomorrow if they did that. But when our kid comes home and tells us that their football coach did it, we said, that's what you need to build character. Good coach. Not all of us say that.
The role of sport in society, it's our rite of passage, and it's our war games. And if you study cultures back through history, even back into ancient history, I was privileged to visit Tikal recently, the Mayan ruin in Guatemala, and there was a game there. And the prize, if you won, the captain of the team was beheaded so that he could spend the rest of his life in glory. And people fought for that, and it was played with a ball. We're talking 1,000 years ago now, and more. You can go back to the game of lacrosse in Native American culture. It was very, very important, a part of the fabric of the culture. The Olympic movement that began in 776 BC, I have been to Olympia, and I've stood at the starting line where those so-called pure amateurs ran. It wasn't so purely amateur. But it is our rite of passage. It's where a young person goes from being a child to becoming a man, because he has to go through this, in our case of football, these collisions and smashes, and if you come out the other end, then you've been transformed from a child to a man. But it's also an expression of war, hopefully without killing anybody. You can choose up sides, yell and scream your head off, go out on a Saturday afternoon or a Sunday afternoon, and act as if you were being violent, and hopefully have some kind of catharsis by the time you leave the stadium, if you're a fan, and hopefully you can walk if you're a player. And hopefully there is a positive aspect to all of that experience. That is a possibility. It gets ugly when the real war stuff continues, where the fans get so hyper they want to kill somebody, usually the coach. I know, because people stand right outside the locker room and wait for the coach to come. And you wouldn't believe the stuff that they shout. You wouldn't believe the words that we are subjected to. Win, lose, or draw. Now, what kind of people are those? Those are the lunatic fringe that take it over the edge. Who is it that threatens coaches' lives and even coaches' wives' lives? So it can get out of kilter and it can get off balance, but there's a possibility of a healthy kind of a rite of passage and getting this war thing out of our system, which cultures seem to need somehow.
As God is my witness, every town I speak in, every town, at some point when I'm coming into the lecture hall or to the assembly room, the organizer will grab me and say off to the side, you know, Rick, I got to tell you, in our town, we take sports pretty damn seriously. Every town. And it's epidemic all over the United States. Everywhere. Every town from Dallas to Tampa to Seattle, it's everywhere. I get a lot of mail. And again, I'm on the front lines. My wife and I have 3 kids involved in youth sports as well. I got a call one time from a dad who called me and said, in all sincerity, Rick, I know you've been involved in baseball for a long time in sports psychology. I'm looking around. My son shows every bit of promise to be a professional, perhaps a big league pitcher. I think with your background, perhaps you can lead me to finding the best summer camp for him, because it looks like he's going to have a chance to go pro. Okay, fine. Well, first of all, how old is your son? Oh, he's 9. Fine. That gives you an idea where we're coming from. I got a letter one time from a woman in, I believe, Ohio, who said to me that her 9-year-old daughter was thrilled because she had made the travel soccer team, which is obviously a competition to be one of the elite players in her town. And the daughter had achieved this cutoff, and she had gotten a new uniform and a shiny satin jacket. It was something prestigious to wear in her school with her peers because she was on the travel team. They got to the first tournament of the year. It was on a road trip. I guess they had 4 or 5 games over a long weekend. And the 9-year-old, it's a team of 9, 10-year-olds, the 9-year-old didn't play in 1 second of any games. And the mom was perplexed, obviously, that the child was discouraged by this. And when the mom went to the coach and said, well, how come my child didn't play in any of the games? The coach said, no, you're mistaken. This is a travel team. We're here to win. If you want to play just for fun, go back to the town rec league. And the mother was like, well, this is a 9-year-old child. How can you do this? Look, your child is a fine athlete, but she's not good enough to play with the other 9, 10-year-olds on a competitive level. If she wants to play and get better, I strongly suggest that you sign her up for a couple of classes, special elite soccer practices during the week, which is something that Jay alluded to before, how people begin to build their own careers off the dreams and hopes of little kids. And on it goes. This happens routinely. As I mentioned before, this is a problem everywhere. And this is a very distinguished panel, and they understand firsthand the problems that parents have today, and coaches as well, because we've obviously gotten to the point where we no longer care so much about whether the kids have fun or whether they think they know what's right for themselves. Obviously, kids come to you and say, well, what do you think I should do? Should I continue to keep just playing this one sport? Should I play in a travel team? Am I better at this sport or another sport? They look to us and obviously want to fulfill parental expectations. It is extraordinarily difficult to raise kids today playing sports, especially if your son or daughter shows any promise or any glimmer of being talented. That's when the problems begin. I do not know who invented travel teams, or elite, or select, or premier, whatever you want to call them. All I know is that they cause big problems. Big problems. And I'm talking to high school coaches around the country. They come and tell me that they have a difficult time in getting kids, top athletes, to come out and play sports as a freshman or sophomore or junior, because the kids at that age have played competitive sports for so long, they say, you know, it doesn't look like I'm going to be the star quarterback or be the star point guard. So you know what, I'll just take this year off and go out and get a job and do something else. And of course the coaches can't understand this. How is it possible that a kid who wants to play sports allegedly for fun is saying, no, I'll do something else? Now, I worked for a number of years with the Cleveland Indians. And in talking to major league stars in spring training during the season, and these guys are the best and the brightest, it struck me as odd that almost to a man, none of these fellows would want their own children to go through youth sports. Why? Because the pressures are too much. They saw the horror stories of coaches who want to win at all costs, of pushy parents. And I'm thinking, if the big leaguers are telling me this, what should we be thinking?
Well, the difference in amateur and professional is rapidly blurring. Growing up, our generation kind of defined amateur as the Olympics and Babe Ruth League and high school and college ball. But now, so much of the talk is, well, what am I going to get paid? And if I go to speak to a group of youngsters and talk about the Super Bowls that I was privileged to play in and what it took to get into the Super Bowls, or just things that I think might be useful for them, if we have question and answer, the first question is, how much did you get paid? How much did Johnny Unitas get paid? How much did Bart Starr get paid? Now, the answers are embarrassingly low because of the era when we played. But the emphasis on amateur is almost gone. A kid runs out between the goalposts. He's 7 years old. He's got on Nike shoes. He's got on the same shoulder pads that we wore in the Pro Bowl. He's got on the same headgear. They're little cheerleaders over there. They got on the same uniforms. Well, maybe not that the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders were, but I mean, it's unbelievable. And so by the time he's 9 years old, he's been to banquets. He's been given trophies. It's all over. He's already done it all. I mean, I've had friends when they were 16 say, well, I'm sick of all this. Why should I continue? I've already done all that. So I think we need to be careful about over-organizing.
How can we obtain the benefits of sports participation and at the same time avoid the problems? The testimony of world-class athletes shows the importance that sports can play in the lives of some of the students and the values which participation can instill when properly integrated into a curriculum. Coach Bill Curry, based on his extensive experience in sports, knows the good that sports can do for those who participate. He also is deeply aware of the problems that accompany sports when sports is poorly coached or poorly managed. Primary and secondary education must carefully consider how it provides the educational structure of youth sports. Since sports can play a role in the transition from youth to adulthood in our culture, it seems too important to leave the private, commercial interests alone. Children are at risk of burning out when the creeping professionalism of youth sports makes the children feel as if there is nothing more of value to experience in sports. Dr. Jay Coakley notes that the rules of discipline have traditionally been different for the school coach than they have been for the classroom teacher. He does not believe these differences are justified. Rick Wolf believes that every community takes their sports seriously. Is it really in the community's best interest to leave sports to the private clubs, uncontrolled parental interests, and commercial interests? Or is it better to put sports under the control of the schools, where sports can assist in the education of our children? How would the best schools balance academics and sports? How can we manage sports to bring about both the academic and personal development in our students?
If I were, say, the head of a movement unit, physical education unit, who I hired would be different in this domain. If I wanted my students in this program more to experience movement as an end, the kind of people I hire would be different. I'd be looking for people who were true believers, who had been there themselves, rather than who had read books about sport being good for people and movement being good for people. So in my interview, I'd be looking for folks who had that twinkle in their eye, who I could tell from the interview had lived it and had been there, because I feel that there's an element of transmitting that, like an English teacher who's in love with Shakespeare. It's much different than an English teacher who needed a job and decided to pick English because they're pretty good at words or something. We'd like the movement people who are like the Shakespeare lovers. I think it'd be a little different, too, in terms of the curriculum. Our curriculum frustrates and alienates in physical education. How does it do that with all of these trained PhDs sitting around? Well, one of our philosophies has been that we need to introduce students to a wide range of activities with the hope that one or two of them would catch, and that the students would say, oh, that's the thing I love, and that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my lifetime. It's not a totally incorrect theory. It happens that way for some people. Problem is, a lot of people learn the activities for 2 or 3 weeks in a high school unit, just long enough to get frustrated and embarrassed, because you can't learn the skills in most of these activities for 2 or 3 weeks. And if you're self-conscious in terms of your embodiment, you don't like your body particularly or the way you look, that exacerbates the physical education turnoff, because they're there in shorts or whatever and feeling uncomfortable to begin with. Then they're given 3 weeks of an activity and embarrassed out there because they can't hit the ball or they can't do whatever, even with a teacher who's not aiming way up here, but just because you can't learn it in 3 weeks. You can't learn paragraph formation in 3 weeks in English. It takes a long time. And so we march the kids through these different activities: 3 weeks of gymnastics, 3 weeks of golf, 3 weeks of basketball. Are you happy yet? Are you enjoying yourselves yet? Frustrated. And so I would change the curriculum to a more in-depth. So if I had playmakers, lovers of sport, and a patient curriculum that allowed students to get below the surface, I think those would be 2 steps that would be spin-offs of my philosophic commitments, and I think would improve the lives of people in terms of balancing movement joys with sedentary joys, and music joys and art joys and other kinds of joys that human beings might have.
I have a daughter who's going to go from kindergarten to 1st grade, so I've thought a lot about it because I care about her, and I want her life to be a good one. And one of the things that it seems from what I've been able to gather is that while there's an encouragement of sports, there's oddly not an integration of sports. So it's a separate compartment, and they do this in their school, but they don't necessarily tie it all together, and I'd really like to see more of that tying together at a very early age. One of the things I noticed when young kids play, in particular, is that it's a rehearsal for life. You know, they're both playing the game, and they're playing roles to try out and to live by, and you see this. I forget who I was talking to. Was talking about when they were a kid, they used to even act out some of the slow motion shots when they were, you know, and they would do the announcers fade in and fade out and all that type of thing, and they were seeing themselves in those roles. Quite literally, they were doing this. And what we do in that process is we create ourselves. That is, we're constantly in this process, not simply of being who we are, but deciding who we're going to become. And sports and play in general can play a tremendously powerful role in shaping that. And the more that we're able to do that in a way that ties in with the whole of the curriculum, then I think everyone's going to gain by that.
There's a wonderful article written by Janice Moulton called Why Everyone Deserves a Sporting Chance. And what she does is argues, and I thoroughly agree with her on this, that sport isn't just like education, it is education. It is something that tells us whether we're going to be a part of society or not. Right? Education provides us with a means of learning about ourselves and learning about the world. Sports does the same thing. We are educated in order to participate in this society. Sports, we do sports for the same reason. I think it has now allowed them an access into the business world. Right? It's some figure that I just saw recently said that 95 or 98% of the CEOs in this country played sports, right? Varsity sports of some sort, either high school or college, right? So it tells you, and in fact a book that I was just reading today says that sports produces leaders. And why? Because it challenges people to compete against themselves, not just against others, but challenges them to be better at what they can do and to accept adversity, recognizing how to take on adversity and go beyond it. And so it teaches you how to achieve success, but it also teaches you how to deal with failure. And so I think for that reason, since we want all people to participate in society, it's important for women to participate as well. So that being said, yes, it does need to be done very early, starting in kindergarten. We don't just let little girls play hopscotch, right? We let them be active. What that means is, right, we don't send them out in little skirts and little dresses and say, don't get dirty, because what you're telling them is that's not a ladylike thing to do. I think we have a perception that women and girls should not participate in sports. It's unladylike, it will harm their reproductive areas and so forth. But Title IX and I think the proliferation of women in sports has shown that those prejudices are really false, and they are prejudices. And I think we see that that's one of the good things about sports. It does show us that where we need to change our own ideas. So when it comes to schools, I think it's more than just PE classes. Right? PE classes are important, but most of them, for some of us, were boring. Right? For some people, they didn't do them at all. Right? The PE teachers are pretty much told, look, you're unimportant, and that's what's sad. Right? So I think, though, if you take PE classes and combine them with a competitive game, then children learn both the process of working together and playing together, but then see that the product is that they achieve at a level they never thought they could achieve. And that's why I think if you start early, and there are games that people can do, you know, where the competition is to their level, not excessively. And I think what happens is that parents, when we see the Little League, for instance, right, we see parents get so involved, right, because in some senses we've taken competition too far, right? So it's important for us to recognize just what that competition is for. It's for developing the child, all of them, not all just about winning and winning at all costs.
Even back into the early 1900s, there were some play educators who tried to integrate math skills and movement skills with triangles on playgrounds, and so they would walk geometric shapes and feel a triangle, a trapezoid, and so forth, as opposed to just seeing one in a book. And I would say there are more creative efforts now than that. And so there is a whole movement in our field of integrating movement with math, integrating movement with social science, Olympic Games, intercultural understanding. And so sport, because it's so ubiquitous and so powerful, I think other educators are saying we got to find some way to hook the kids. Movement's a way to hook them. And so we need the help of the physical educators to coordinate things and find out how we can bring social studies and movement together. And so it's a realm of promise, I would say. And I would like it as a holistic educator, so that we're trying to free the person. We're not trying to free their mind in school.
Successfully managing youth sports in schools requires the explicit identification of the benefits and liabilities associated with sports in schools. The realities of competing educational values and limited time and resources make optimizing both sport and education a difficult management challenge. Dr. Scott Kretchmar argues that primary and secondary school teachers of sports should have a love of sport as an end in itself, and that the curriculum of physical education should be changed to allow for students to learn the love of doing sports and movement. Since the experience of the love of sport is special, like the love of music and art, the best schools would creatively manage their curriculum to assist their students to experience the joy that sports can provide. Developing the love of sports is a value which can pay health dividends for a lifetime. Professor Larry Hinman asked how we might bring athletic activity into the primary and secondary school curriculum. Doing so may teach values and virtues which help students become more fully functioning human beings. Dr. Jan Boxell claims that sports is education, that a student who participates in the experience of sports will learn who he or she is, and the experience obtained in sports will contribute significantly to the person he or she will become. There was a time when everyone would say that elementary and secondary schools should develop character in their students, that schools should instill the values and virtues of an educated, successful person. While not everyone may agree on all the values and virtues that schools should develop, most would agree that self-discipline, cooperation, teamwork, planning and time management, goal setting, continuous effort are values which should be developed in young students. Since these values can be developed through quality sports participation, educators, parents, and communities should consider how they can provide the experience of quality sports participation as an integral part of their community's primary and secondary education.